Hello, everybody. We're going to start in just a few minutes, so 2-minute warning. Good afternoon, and welcome to our program on the intersection of racial justice and restorative justice. We are happy that you were able to join us, and we welcome you warmly, and we welcome those who are joining us via live stream. We have a terrific group of speakers and panelists for today's program. My name is Father Dan Griffith. I serve as the Wenger Family Faculty Fellow of Law and founding director of a new initiative on restorative justice and healing here at the law school. I am also pastor of Our Lady of Lourdes in Minneapolis and Archdiocesan liaison for restorative justice and healing. Last month, UST Law launched with great energy the Initiative on Restorative Justice and Healing, IRJH, which has a threefold focus on naming and helping heal harm from institutional and leadership failures, racial injustice, and polarization. IRJH will provide the opportunity for colloquia, conferences, community outreach, and a coming restorative justice law clinic, all of which will involve local and national partners. Join us next month for a webinar, Harm and Hope in a Polarized World. More details coming soon. Today's program on racial justice and restorative justice is the inaugural program of the initiative, and we are honored that St. Thomas's Racial Justice Initiative, founded and led by Dr. Yohuru Williams, is our co-sponsor today. Dr. Williams and I both appreciate the strong institutional support that Dr. Sullivan and Dean Vischer have given these initiatives. Restorative justice is a philosophical and practical approach to harm that has become a worldwide movement. It has gained such broad traction because it works. Restorative practices are consistently effective in response to harm. They are also adaptable. Restorative practices are employed effectively across multiple disciplines, professions, and areas of society. Restorative justice is rooted in the indigenous practices of First Nation peoples of North America and New Zealand. These practices were born of deep wisdom sourced in the rich native cultures. It is critical that those who use restorative practices today do so with great respect, honor, and gratitude to the indigenous peoples from which they were born, without any movement toward cultural appropriation. Some universities, including St. Thomas, have begun meetings and events with a land acknowledgement. We are on what was Dakota land until the land was ceded to the United States through the Treaty of 1851. Treaty negotiations were driven by the American Fur Company, which had been providing supplies to the Dakota in exchange for fur. As the lands were overhunted and as the European demand for fur dropped, the system collapsed. Fur traders were essentially bailed out by the U.S. government. The government got 24 million acres of land, and the Dakota got almost nothing. Many of our Native American colleagues working in the area of restorative justice have personally told us and conveyed that more than land acknowledgments, we need transformative justice and distributive justice, structural and societal change that leads to greater equity and promotes human flourishing for all people. The initiative on restorative justice and healing is rooted in the Catholic intellectual tradition and biblical justice. Catholic social teaching and restorative justice align powerfully as both aim at the goals of attaining justice, promoting human flourishing, and prophetically critiquing unjust social structures. It is in this prophetic dimension that biblical justice, Catholic social teaching, and restorative justice must intersect in naming, stopping, and in helping heal the deep and persistent harm of racial injustice in the United States and beyond. Restorative justice invites people to tell their stories, including stories of harm, injustice, and exclusion. I am struck by the enduring wisdom of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from the Birmingham jail. It's an extraordinary document that I have assigned every year to law students, no matter what course I'm teaching. Dr. King was a gifted preacher indeed, but he would have made a great lawyer. In trying to exhort white, moderate Christian leaders to move from apathy to the cause of justice, King writes, "Injustice must be exposed with all the tension its exposure creates to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured." This is precisely where restorative practices and the cause for racial justice can powerfully intersect, by exposing injustice and its pernicious effects through storytelling, by naming the harm. My own experience of hearing stories of the harm of racial injustice began more than a quarter century ago when I was in law school, where black classmates and friends of mine shared their experiences with me and our friend group. I was saddened and dismayed by their experience, and I can feel that today. But this dose of harmful reality in time became a source of inspiration to join the cause for justice. Today, racial injustice and its attendant harm sadly persist, as this community of Minneapolis and St. Paul knows all too well in the killing of George Floyd and resulting social convulsions seen throughout the nation and the world. This city here, Minneapolis, is ground zero in terms of racial injustice, and Minnesota sadly manifests some of the most acute racial disparities in the country across multiple categories. Pope Francis has said often that reality is more important than ideas, and that is what restorative justice seeks to do, to convey the truth of experience and harm in a way that is human, vital, and hopefully on to transformative justice. We have a terrific program on tap for you today. In a moment, I will introduce Dr. Williams, who will deliver the keynote on the history and context of racial injustice in the United States and also the intersection of restorative justice and racial justice. After the keynote, my colleague Hank Shea will moderate a panel of UST law alumni and students highlighting local restorative justice organizations. The first panel includes our two inaugural student fellows of the initiative, Ricardo Johnson, the Tom Johnson Student Fellow, and Emma Shrum, the Justice Janine Geske Student Fellow. And if they could stand up, they're to my left. Our late friend Tom Johnson, whose spirit we feel in this work, and Janine Geske, who is a pioneer in the area of restorative justice and our advisory board chair and watching from Wisconsin, are pioneers in the field of justice and healing. Congratulations to Ricardo and Emma, both deserving of this honor. The final panel will be moderated by Dean Rob Vischer, which will bring together 4 experts who will speak about the intersection of faith, restorative justice, and the work of racial justice. Father Chris Collins, our VP of Mission at St. Thomas, will bring our program to a close with his reflections and encouragement to continue the vital conversation. A reception follows the program, and all are welcome to attend. Lawyers, today's program has been approved for 2 elimination of bias CLE credits. A big thank you to Julie Craven, Associate Director of IRJH, for all that she's done on the logistics and communications and bringing this together. Hank Shea, who has been extraordinary in the work he's done, Dr. Williams as well, Dean Rob Vischer, Carrie Hilger, Angela Disick, and Josh Zenner, for all that they have done in support of today's program. Thanks also to our law students who are helping host and welcome those in attendance. Now to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Yohuru Williams is Distinguished University Chair and Professor of History and founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas. He received his PhD from Howard University in 1998. Dr. Williams is the author of Black Politics, White Power, Civil Rights, Black Power, and Black Panthers in New Haven, Rethinking the Black Freedom Movement, Teaching Beyond the Textbook, 6 Investigative Strategies. Dr. Williams has appeared on a variety of local and national radio and television programs, most notably ABC, CNN, MSNBC, Al Jazeera, America, BET, C-SPAN, Today, Fox Business News, Fresh Outlook, and Huff Point Live, and also NPR. He was featured in the Ken Burns PBS documentary, Jackie Robinson, and the Stanley Nelson PBS documentary, The Black Panthers. He is also one of the hosts of the History Channel's web show, Sound Smart. Dr. Williams' scholarly articles have appeared in the America Bar Association Insights on Law and Society, the Organization of American Historians Magazine of History, the Black Scholar, the Journal of Black Studies, Pennsylvania History, Delaware History, the Journal of Civil and Human Rights, and Black History Bulletin. Dr. Williams is also presently finishing a new book entitled In the Shadow of the Whipping Post, Lynching, Capital Punishment, and Jim Crow Justice in Delaware, 1865 to 1965, under contract with Cambridge University Press. In addition to all of this, what his colleagues at St. Thomas and those he collaborates with in the important work of justice have found is Dr. Williams is a man of a deep sense of justice, of passion, of intelligence, and also of generosity of spirit. We have all benefited from that, and we will benefit from that today. So we warmly welcome Dr. Yohuru Williams.
Thanks, Father Dan. I appreciate that introduction. You got a little excited there, and I love your passion, but when you got excited, you hit the slide advance. I was like, well, there goes my presentation. But that would have been okay. I really appreciate you, Father Dan, and Hank, and the work that you've done together in launching this initiative. We all know how important this is. You mentioned the words of Pope Francis. It made me think immediately of James Baldwin, who said, the world changes according to the way people see it. And if you can alter, even by a millimeter, the way people look at reality, then you can change it. What I hope to do today, in the very short time that I have with you, and there is a giant hook off to my right waiting to yank me off the stage in 30 minutes, is change the way that we're thinking about this moment and change the way that we're thinking about restorative justice. I want to begin with some conventional wisdom from Thurgood Marshall, who said that really in this conversation, and all conversations about justice, it really comes down to intent. And I want to spend a lot of time with you today talking about intent and intentionality when we talk about restorative justice, because those things matter in this conversation. You could ask my good friend Curtis DeYoung, who you'll hear from later today. You can ask Randy Elise Roth, who you'll hear from later today. They both will share that in the work that they do in community, intentionality is really the measure of impact in justice work. Thurgood Marshall put it this way: what is the quality of your intent? Certain people have a way of saying things that shake us at the core. Even when the words do not seem harsh or offensive, the impact is shattering. Social determinants of health is shattering. Discussions about housing inequality are shattering. Police brutality is shattering. Sexual violence is shattering. What we could be experiencing is the intent behind the words. When we intend to do good, we do. When we intend to do harm, it happens. What each of us must come to realize is that our intent always comes through. In conversations about restorative justice, in conversations about implicit bias, in conversations about how we shift the way that we're thinking about making impact in this moment, it's our intent that needs to drive this work, and it needs to come through. Having said that, we think about what the American Bar Association put out in August of 2016 regarding this question of appropriate conduct for lawyers. And it says, it is professional misconduct for a lawyer to engage in conduct that the lawyer knows or reasonably should know. Ha ha. It's harassment or discrimination on the basis of race, sex, religion, national origin, ethnicity, disability, age, sexual orientation, gender identity, marital status, or socioeconomic status, and conduct related to the practice of law. But I want to expand that definition for you today, and I want to say that we should be thinking about it being professional misconduct if we aid and abet systems that perpetuate any of the things that are on that long shopping list. Ha ha. Because the reality is, simply to do that in the course of one's practice becomes a reflection of individual action. To think about taking steps to dismantle that within society as a whole becomes a reflection of our shared responsibility to achieve what Martin Luther King called the beloved community, but what I'd like to call, and what I want us to think about as the just society. Having said that, when we talk about intent versus intentionality, and we look at this in the context of law, for me it comes down to the Chauvin trial, but not in terms of who represented Derek Chauvin and who represented the Floyd family and who was there. It comes down to what happened in that Cup Foods. It comes down to the policies, practices, and procedures that created the conditions that led to that circumstance in the first place, which is really what needs to be dismantled when we talk about restorative justice. If we're going to complete the circle, it can't end with a guilty verdict for Derek Chauvin. It has to go back to the beginning and say, what is the arc here that led to the circumstances, whether we're talking about what happened with George Floyd, whether we're talking about what happened with Alicia Euler, whether we're talking about what happened with Charles McMillan, or any of the other people who lined up on that day randomly, who reflect certain elements of injustice in our society, economically, socially, politically, and culturally. Remember, simply go back to the videotape. The group of people that line up to challenge the officers on that day are people of color and women, which emphasize the fact that people of color and our women in our society are still largely silenced. They could not compel Officer Chauvin to remove his knee Thurgood Marshall also reflected on the need for intentionality in a longitudinal engagement on issues of race. Thurgood Marshall never believed that Brown versus Board of Education was the end game. Thurgood Marshall always talked in terms of a commitment to racial justice that extended beyond what happened in 1955 in terms of the Supreme Court's decision. In fact, he said, I wish I could say that racism and prejudice were only distant memories. But he says, and he's asking us to take action, we must, these are action words, dissent from the indifference. We must dissent from the apathy. We must dissent from the fear, the hatred, and the mistrust. We must dissent because America can do better, because America has no choice but to do better. Not make America great again, but America needs to do better. And I want to be clear that in sharing that language in the way that he does, what Thurgood Marshall is doing is pivoting around these core democratic values which define our polity, but which we often violate in the most egregious ways. Because it's one thing to say life, it's another thing for many states in this union to have laws like stand your ground. It's important also for us to understand that American tragedies have always been rooted in a repudiation of core democratic values. Why does it take 127 dead women and girls in 1911 as a result of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire to get reform necessary to ensure occupational safety in this country? If we really believed in and were intentional about the way that we thought about justice in certain circumstances for certain groups and classes who are voiceless, it'd be a very different enterprise. Could talk about a variety of those, but I think at the core what this pivots on is this idea of punishment versus restoration. And when we think about punishment, that's half the arc. If we think about the arc of justice as a circle, if the foundation is punishment, then you're only getting half the arc. If you're talking about restoration, you're talking about rebuilding, reforming, reclaiming, reimagining, resoldering that connection and community, and doing so in a way that privileges our shared humanity. And I think that's what gets lost in a lot of this conversation is the importance of our shared humanity. My good friend, Father Chris Collins, who we recently were able to bring to our team at the university, is very good about articulating this in terms of our university community. But the reality is that we have to think about this much broader, not just in terms of what happens here in Minneapolis, St. Paul, but what happens in the United States, what happens globally, because this extends beyond borders. And the reality is in that conversation that people like to quote the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's comment that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Now I'm going to do my best impression of my good friend Rob Vischer here, because this is the familiar king that people are comfortable with. But if you really want to get at the other king, then I would commend you to read Professor Vischer's book on Dr. King, which really navigates this question of where King stood with regard to racial justice and questions of conscience. And I want to say that here, we don't want to just deal with this quote. We want to go back to King's source material, because he's taking this from abolitionist minister Theodore Parker. And I want to say this to you early because timelines are important. Theodore Parker occupies this earth between 1810 and 1860. A moment in this country that is dominated by racial upheaval very similar to our own. If Theodore Parker loses hope, Theodore Parker is not part of the abolitionist movement, which in that moment was about restorative justice, right? Completing the circle. Not half the arc, but the whole circle. In fact, Theodore Parker says, and this is where King has taken us from, I do not pretend, he writes this in 1853, 7 years before he passes from this earth, I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by experience of sight. Please don't lose me today. I've lost the capacity to give an academic talk, and so I end up preaching. So that's what you're getting. But I want you to follow me here because this is important. He continues, I can divine it by conscience, and from what I see, I'm sure it bends toward justice. That is not the hopeful statement that Martin Luther King's statement sounds like, but it is a statement which by definition commits us to action. If we take, in the way that President Obama did during his campaign, He was fond of quoting the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, the moral arc of the university is long, but it bends toward justice. It implies that it's bending that way, so maybe we don't have to do anything in order to complete that circle. But the reality is, we have a duty and a responsibility to grab on to that part that's hanging and pull and tug with all of our might to complete that circle in a way that creates opportunities for justice and equality for all Americans. You see that in the fabric of the work that Randy does with Interfaith Action St. Paul. You see that in the fabric of the work that's being done here in terms of restorative justice. When I say this to you, when I say timelines are important, if we lose hope, if we look at the timeline of someone like John Lewis, he's born in 1940 in a world in which segregation is the norm. If he accepts that, if there's no intentionality behind the way that he's thinking about bending that arc, then he's not at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965 shedding blood on what would ultimately be the incident that we associate with the push for the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I want to say to you today that John Lewis dies in 2020 in the midst of a national Black Lives Matter movement where there's a retrenchment on voting rights, where we're talking about the need for a John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and yet in his final communication to the American people, which is published posthumously in the New York Times, John Lewis hasn't lost hope. John Lewis sounds a lot like Cardinal Newman in talking about a second spring. We can't, in the winter of our discontent, assume that the logical work of others that has been done to lay the foundations for justice have been in vain. And so he's simply asking us, if we look at this, to complete that arc. If we go back to this and we think about how we can take Theodore Parker and make this into a framework that would be a little bit more digestible and accessible, I want to point out that if we put the word intentionality between those big 3 points that Theodore was talking about, intentionality not by sight, but by practice. In fact, I said this the other day to a group of law students, Hank and Dan brought me in, but restorative justice is a practice. And what does that mean by practice? So when we say intentionality, not by sight, but by practice, it means by acting, by doing, not by seeing and quoting, not by citing statistics, not by being passive, not by assuming that this organization which is committed to this work is going to do that work in this circle, but that we have to work in concentric circles to connect the dots, to break the chains, to promote equity and justice. Number 2, intentionality defined by conscience. I want to be very clear because this is important. Again, I go back to Rob's second book. We're talking about Dean Vischer and I teach together, so we're starting to quote each other now. But the importance of understanding this is a matter of conscience. Practice flows from waking up every day and recognizing, not in a non-hopeful way, but in a very hopeful way, that in our lifetime, we can bend that arc just a little bit more. Last but not least, and this is very important, intentionality committed to completing the circle itself. See, I want to tell you what Dr. King writes in his book, Strength to Love, in chapter 4, where he says, sincerity and conscientiousness in themselves are not enough. History has proven that these noble virtues may degenerate into tragic vices. Nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. In fact, King concludes, devoid of intelligence, goodness, and conscientiousness will become brutal forces leading to shameful crucifixions. Never must the church, he argued, but I say we, in the legal community, tire of reminding people they have a moral responsibility to be intelligent. And I want to be clear, when we talk about a moral responsibility to be intelligent, that's going to manifest itself in the sententiality of completing the circle. Again, a model of justice that ends with punishment is that semicircle where the foundation is punishment. But we have to go through that uncomfortable process of pulling past, breaking new ground in ways that allow us to look at things differently. In fact, the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray, whom I love, put it this way. And she was talking about restorative justice in a moment before we were talking about restorative justice. She said, I intend to destroy segregation by positive and embracing methods. She continues, when my brothers try to draw a circle to exclude me, and trust me, if anybody understood circles, it was the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray. When she went to Howard University, she was the only woman. And so the male students attempted to exclude her until she graduated at the top of her class, and they couldn't exclude her anymore. And then when she went to Yale University, she'd be very upset. When she went to Yale University, the white students attempted to exclude her, so she spent her whole life breaking down barriers, and yet she never lost hope. In fact, she was all about pushing through and pulling through circles. Watch this. She says, when my brothers try to draw a circle to exclude me, I shall draw a larger circle to include them. And she concludes, where they speak out for the privileges of a puny group, I shall shout for the rights of all mankind. We think about it this way. Looking at these luminaries in African American history, thinking about this as Randy likes to talk about it, as a process of reclamation. Not by sight, but by practice means that we can't be indifferent, apathetic, or blind to the shouts of despair that come up from communities of color with regard to policing and justice practices, sentencing practices, and other carceral practices in our society which tend to promote rather than elevate justice. We can't, if we think about it this way, assume that removing the visible signs of inequality, like Confederate statues, is moving us in the direction of eradicating racism. We have to think about getting at those deeper structural issues, which requires that deeper commitment which I shared with you earlier. In fact, let me go one step further with regard to the legal profession. Because for people of color, blind justice often manifests itself in racial bias that is baked into the very fabric of our legal system in this country. We know it because we experience it, we witness it, and so we have to make a commitment in a broad way to undermining and repelling it. It's a quote from an individual who participated in a panel on restorative justice, and she said, look, the problem with restorative justice and racial justice is it's creating something there's nothing to restore when we've always been oppressed. I want to be clear about what I mean by that. When the standard has been exclusion, when the standard has been a denial of rights, when the standard has been injustice, we have to think and reimagine differently. In fact, as Curtis DeYoung says in Reconciliation, Our Greatest Challenge, Our Only Hope, reconciliation can only occur between equals. There could be, in fact, people want to jump and get to reconciliation before they talk about truth. That acknowledging process is critical to the process of restorative justice because it puts us in a space to recognize that. Truth-telling is one of the principal foundations for equality. More importantly, when we don't tell the truth, and one of the reasons that I'm so happy to work with Interfaith Action and that Randy is part of this panel is that we talk about this with regard to African Americans. We should also look very carefully here in Minnesota in particular in the harm that has been done to Native peoples, to indigenous peoples in this space. Father Dan began by talking about that in terms of the land acknowledgement, which is simply the first step. But I want to go to Chief Joseph, 1879, famous speech which he gives where he's talking about the failed treaties. And what he says is, and I want to talk about this in context of intentionality, and I promise I'm almost done. But Chief Joseph says, good words do not pay for my dead people. They do not pay for my country now overrun by white men. They do not protect my father's grave. They do not pay for all my horses and cattle. Good words will not give me back my children. He's writing this in 1879, and here we are in 2021 in a national conversation about Indian schools and the harm and damage perpetuated in indigenous communities by virtue of policies, practices, and procedures which undermine the very fabric of indigenous societies, which tore apart families, which some people have argued could even be seen as a form of genocide. Don't lose me here. He concludes, good words will not give my people good health and stop them from dying. If this is making you uncomfortable, go back to the very first slide with Thurgood Marshall, because this was Marshall's point. Sometimes our intent may seem harsh when we're hearing and listening to those words, but if we think about this in our contemporary context, he's talking about just about every issue that we're dealing with today, but he's calling it in 1879. If we were truthful about the foundations of inequality, it wouldn't be such a surprise to us in our contemporary moment that we haven't triumphed over these things, because we always make our base the arc and not the circle. Let me conclude with you today by saying this. Chief Joseph, Martin Luther King, the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray, if we think about them in terms of restorative justice practices, are modeling in some sense in their language the inclusion of all parties, establishing and listening to what survivors want, an acknowledgement of the harm, encouraging the perpetrator to take responsibility, and then the completion of that circle. This is what Curtis is talking about in that piece, not reconciliation that begins with truth and reconciliation for reconciliation's sake, but reconciliation that grows out of that acknowledgement and establishment of that acknowledgement of harm and the work that needs to be done in order to repair the damage. If we look at it that way, then we will be talking about different metrics for core democratic values. Then we will be talking about not a moment in our history, but an actual movement. And by movement, I use the definition, a series of organized activities toward an objective, which means intentionality around restorative justice. It bottoms on what the Reverend Dr. King suggests, that shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Because the reality is, nothing I said to you today is a surprise. Maybe I said it differently, with more passion, but the reality is, it's no secret to any of us. In fact, let me end with you with a slide that I love to share from the Niagara Movement from 1905. This was an organization of African-American reformers that were seeking to promote a just and equitable society in their moment. And in their declaration of sentiments, the first thing, or one of the things on their list, was courts. I just read this to you because I want you to think about this in terms of resonating in our contemporary moment. Courts, we demand upright judges in courts, juries selected without discrimination on account of color, and the same measure of punishment and the same efforts at reformation for black as for white offenders. I could be reading from Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow. I could be reading from the gospel, but it's not quite the good news, of last summer, when many people were shocked to the quick in the way that Rothman writes about the asylum in 1971. Every generation discovers prisons, is shocked by what it finds, pledges to reform and to deal with that injustice, and then, under the weight of the work necessary in order to maintain that commitment, wither and die, only for the next generation to come along and say, how come no one's ever done anything about prisons? How come no one's ever done anything about race? How come no one's ever done anything about gender? How come? Intentionality means now is the time for action. Intentionality means that we look at our society, we talk about these things in a way that allow us to look at poverty, injustice, violence, and ignorance in a way that commit us to this idea of completing the circle. And if we do that, then we're in a position to talk about restorative justice as a practice, as intentional, as something that defines us as a community, not something that we simply do out of expedience or a sense of guilt out of what happened last summer. The reality is, this is the work of restoring and redeeming America. Thank you. Set a timer for myself and I made it.
Thank you, Yohuru, for those inspiring remarks. We could not have asked for a more appropriate way to send the message that we all need to hear today. Welcome to our first panel, How We Can Seek Racial Justice Through Restorative Justice Practices. My name is Hank Shea, and with Father Griffith, I've been teaching a course here on restorative justice, law, and healing for several years, and I'm a fellow with the new initiative on restorative justice and healing. Our group today will provide you a brief snapshot on how law students here at St. Thomas have sought to eliminate bias and prejudice and work towards racial justice through participation in community restorative justice programs throughout the Twin Cities. This has been a core requirement of the course that we have taught. The goal of the panel is to inspire everyone here to learn more about these community programs and to take part in either them or similar restorative justice opportunities here in our community. Towards that end, our panelists and I will stay after at the reception and we'll be happy to answer any further questions you have, because you're just going to get a small taste of what these programs involve today. Let me introduce our students. They will be Ricardo Johnson III is to my immediate right, your left. He will summarize the Minnesota Peace Building's Come to the Table program. It was started and it's led by Chriselle Schell, who was a member of the law school's community justice program before she went on to Minnesota Peace Building, where she's done tremendous work. Ricardo is a third-year student here at the University of St. Thomas. He's a very involved member of our community. As Father Griffith noted at the outset, he is the inaugural Tom Johnson Student Fellow for our new initiative. This past summer, he spent many hours summarizing, reading, and reflecting on course materials that we will be using in future courses here at the law school. He also serves as the Diversity and Inclusion Liaison for the school's D&I committee, as well as involved in student government. In this role, Ricardo serves as a voice for diverse and underrepresented students. Along with these positions, Ricardo is also the director of the school's negotiation team, as part of the transactional law director for the Business Law Society, and also he serves as an admissions ambassador here. After graduation, he will go to work for the law firm of Ballard Spahr in their mergers and acquisitions group as an associate. Seated next to Ricardo is Eduardo Salgado Diaz. He will recount his participation in the community program, the Circle of Peace, which is a movement in St. Paul, and also reflect on his restorative justice experiences, which there are many. He has an amazing background of dedication to serving other people. He served in the U.S. military, fixing medevac Black Hawk helicopters. He was a Spanish community liaison for the St. Paul Public Library, and he taught middle schoolers in both Minneapolis and abroad. As a teacher, Eduardo incorporated restorative justice techniques into his teaching practices to avoid creating long-lasting negative consequences for his students. While in law school, Eduardo was a clinician in both the immigration clinic here as well as in the criminal juvenile defense clinic. During the summers, he worked for the Southern Minnesota Regional Legal Services as part of their Agricultural Workers Project, and he also served with the Sentencing Division of the Ramsey County Attorney's Office. Currently, Eduardo works as an assistant public defender for Hennepin County, where he provides client-centered representation for members of this community. And then finally, at the end, we have Emma Shrum. Emma will be describing her work with the Restorative Justice Community Action Program. Emma Shrum, as you heard from Father, is the inaugural Janine Geske Student Fellow for our new initiative. She's also a dual degree Masters of Social Work and JD student here at the University of St. Thomas. Prior to graduate school, she served at-risk youth in southern Minnesota at a charter school dedicated to aligning Native American values, language, and culture to student education. She then served as a crisis response worker, serving sexually exploited youth on juvenile probation. Her experiences compelled her to seek legal knowledge and skills to enable Emma to serve as a more powerful advocate. While in law school, she clerked with the Washington County Human Trafficking Task Force. She served as a clinical social worker at the Mayo Clinic, and she now works as a member of a corporate compliance team dedicated to cultivating a culture of integrity and empowering ethical practices. So I think we will lead off with Ricardo, and I believe for the sake of the people on the live stream, we're going to have them each come up and speak here. I think it's the best way to communicate. Ricardo.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Professor Shea. And I have to say quick that following up Dr. Williams is a tough act to do, so we'll have to probably rethink how we do that in the future. Oh, and I can take off my mask as well, which probably makes it easier here. I'm here to talk about Coming to the Table, which is a national organization that uses the indigenous people's practice of a healing circle to address racial injustices in our society today. I'll speak mainly about the 4 pillars of the organization and then speak to some testimonials that can bring light to some of those pillars. The first pillar is making connections, to establish a link with another through shared history or a common interest in exploring and healing from the past. The testimonial that I think stays with me the most was hearing from a white man from the South talking about his relationship with Civil War statutes, especially from the Confederacy. Unfortunately, in our society today, we are very polarized, as I'm sure all of you are aware. And so when myself as an African American man and the people who I associate myself with see Confederate statutes, the only thing that I can see are the people who wanted to enslave my ancestors. And that's a difficult thing to swallow. What the man spoke about in the video was that his ancestors fought fought for the Confederacy, and for the right purpose or not, they were brutally murdered, which coming from my perspective, thinking about that, I can understand that wanting to commemorate your ancestors for their death is something that, I understand. Whether I agree with it or not is not necessarily the point of Come to the Table. It's just allowing me to have a different perspective, hear something different than what I do in my everyday life. The second one is healing wounds, to address personal or collective harms and move forward towards repair. I was able to hear an interesting testimonial from the 6th great descendant of Thomas Jefferson, who, as anybody who has paid attention to maybe the Hamilton musical or to history in general, there are flaws to our 3rd president. What he spoke a lot about was past is always a part of us, and in order to move forward, we have to address that past and then continue to use it as what launches us into the future. And I think that whether your ancestors did something good or did something bad, everyone carries with us the acts of our fathers and mothers and sisters and brothers and the people who have come before us. And in order to move forward, we have to address what has happened in the past. Along with that is the 3rd pillar, facing history. And the definition is to explore and discuss often unacknowledged portions of an individual's or collective history. This testimonial came from two women, one a white woman who has done research on her family and found out that not only were her ancestors slave owners, but her ancestor wrote a 200-page book talking about the best way to, quote, break slaves, and how she had to face her own history to move forward and be a part of these healing conversations because of what her ancestors have done in the past. And come at it not in a way of that perpetuates white guilt, but acknowledging the fact that what her ancestors did was wrong, and then being an advocate for future action. And then conversely was an African American woman who spoke about not knowing what her ancestors did because of bad records kept through slavery. And I'll tell a quick story that happened to my sister in middle school, coming from a predominantly white institution. It was Ancestor Day, and so each student went around and talked about were they, Irish, Polish, Italian, where did their ancestors come from? And unfortunately, my sister didn't have an answer. And so these are the types of harm that can happen to African Americans in our society today that are tough to move forward. The last one is taking action to address injustices of the past in order to move forward into the future together. And I want to say that again because this story especially had the biggest impact on me. Taking action to address injustices of the past in order to move into the future together. So the question that it asks is, how can we seek justice without dealing with the harms from the past? And Coming to the Table believes that you can't, and I agree with that. Really interesting story and testimonial that happened. They had 2 women who came up on the screen, and one of them was named Phoebe Kilby, and she was an older white woman, and the other one was Raquelia Kilby, and she was a middle-aged black woman. And so with the same name, you think to yourself, well, could they be related? And they tell the story of Phoebe learning of the history of her past and then connecting with Raquelia, saying that her family most likely owned Raquelia's ancestors. And she sent an email and talked about, what can I do to address this harm, to work with you, to move forward? And it turns out that Raquelia and her father were working to change the name of the local school. And so Phoebe came and spoke at the last hearing with the school board, and they think that it was her voice in unity that pushed the school to change the name. And so Coming to the Table is a great organization that allows each of us to come and not necessarily change our perspective, but to hear something else that could understand how people from across the table think about different things in our society. So happy to represent them today. Thank you.
Okay, speaking of tough acts to follow, thank you everyone for coming today, and I want to shout out especially to Tina Seagal today, which I hope I pronounced your name correctly, even though I connected with you briefly before. I already am in a rush of looking out at all your faces, but thank you, Tina, for being here. I had the privilege, as Professor Shea shared, to go to a peace building circle that was facilitated by Tina, and I'd like to reflect on restorative justice and my experience in courts in general and what I feel like I really took away from that experience. And if it was one word, it would be authenticity. Authenticity is what came from that circle. Restorative justice circles bring participants together who create shared values. And in those shared values, the goal is to allow each participant to show up and to be as authentic as they can, as their most authentic self. Now, authenticity is scary, it's vulnerable, it requires safety. So I'd like you to think, which of these two stories makes you feel safe? As Hank shared, I was a social worker prior to law school and had the opportunity to sit in many courtrooms with my clients who were young African American, Native American women, often in spaces that were male dominated in that courtroom, often in spaces that were dominated by white faces, white people, a lot of legalese. And in these courtrooms, my clients listened and they heard about their story. They heard about who they were. They heard the narrative of someone else telling them what they had done, how they had failed, the harm, the risk that they posed to their communities. In those spaces, I watched as my clients would become physically agitated, distressed, as their own story, their narrative, they no longer are writing. It becomes something unrecognizable to them in legalese, and something they don't understand. Often physical frustration, verbal outbursts, which would then be admonished because it's not appropriate in court. That was one experience. The other experience was with Tina. I listened to a man, a probationer in Ramsey County, talk about his experience, talk about his offense, his charge, the addiction and the circumstances that led him there, his remorse, his guilt, his ownership, but also his hope for the future, his ambitions, his commitments not only to himself but to his community. And in that space, there were community members that responded, that listened, that supported, that maybe challenged. But in that space, he was multifaceted. He was not his charge, he was not his conviction, but a multidimensional person. All of us sitting here are multifaceted. The hats we wear, the positions we wear, the roles we have, the experiences we have, color the lenses we view the world in, and they color the experiences we have. So I ask you to think, what color would those lenses have been for my clients, sitting in a room with no one who looked like them, with no one who spoke like them, my clients who had experience of police brutality, my clients who maybe were truant, but possibly there was abuse in the home. I am so grateful for the experience that I had with Tina, because not only did it shed light on the multifaceted personality and the multifaceted experience that offenders have, but also it allowed me to show up as my most authentic self. All of us sitting here today, I don't know whether you came here as a student, a professional, whatnot, we wear hats, and those hats create expectations for how we show up in certain spaces and what we expect to get out of it and what we expect to contribute. And in that space, I was not a student, I was not a social worker, I was not for one side or the other, but I was simply a community member to observe, to bear witness, and to have humility in that moment. Restorative justice, I feel, is impactful, powerful. It allows us to be seen and heard, and in that, it opens the door for authenticity. It opens the door for ownership. Ownership to say, I'm remorseful for this experience. I'm remorseful for my action because my side has been told. It opens the door to acknowledge systemic impact that sometimes isn't present in a one-dimensional space. So thank you, Tina. I encourage all of you to get involved, to learn more about restorative justice, and thank you all for being here tonight and at least taking the first step.
My name is Eduardo Salgado Diaz. And when I got invited to come speak on this, for a second there, I thought that they had picked the wrong person, because I honestly thought, what can I contribute to this great conversation? So I really thought about it, about if I was one of the right people for this. And I went back through what restorative justice, what I've seen it do in my life, and in the lives of those around me. So I would like to share some of those today. I was a middle school teacher at a school about 1.5 miles south of here called Anderson United. As part of Minneapolis Public Schools, when I taught there, it was around 70% Hispanic, 20% East African, 10% African American, Native American. And I showed up day one as a teacher, and it was very easy to just go along with the system, to fill out the form that's like, oh, a student misbehaved in this way, fill out the form, send it to the vice principal. It was very easy. And when you're a first-year teacher, your time is so important to you. You got to plan. You got to send reports to parents. That I'm sad to say, for the first few months, I would just write the form. And then I started learning about restorative justice through professional development that teachers also have to go through. And I in my head, I thought, you know what, it's going to take a lot of time. Is it really worth it? But I took a gamble, and I said, you know what, let's do it for my students. And by union contract, our lunches were supposed to be our own. Like we really were not supposed to even interact with students during lunches, because they wanted us to just have time to ourselves. But I would take those precious 30 minutes to build relationships with students. And whenever something went haywire, as in any middle school would, I would invite the parties. So one of the best examples I have for it is something as simple as a stolen cell phone, where we know the student whose phone it was, we know the student that was found with the phone, and it would have been just easy to write the form and say, okay, the student's suspended for X many days for theft. But I brought the students in, and at times, I incorporated their parents too, which was coordinating adults and kids in a short time frame was hard. But the two people at the end of it were able to see why this event happened. They were able to realize the hurt that one did to the other, not only to that individual, but to their parents, the parents who worked for many hours to be able to afford a cell phone for their child. We saw the hurt that the person that took the phone did to their own parents in just them thinking of like, oh, how could my child have done this? And we saw that the child whose phone was taken was able to become friends with the person who took his phone over the course of the next few months. So this is just one example. In a classroom, for the most part, is one world, built-in world. And I had the fortune of being able to teach these students for 3 years in a row. So I was their teacher 6th grade, 7th grade, and 8th grade. And the changes that I saw throughout those years were that they started policing themselves because they started viewing themselves as a community. It was no longer me that had to act as the authoritarian in telling students to stop misbehaving, but it was one another. And even when a new student came in, I remember it, 8th grade, first day teaching 8th grade, students had me for 2 years already. And this student walked in, and he was trying to show that he was in control. Day one, and he starts cussing me out. F you, F that, you're nothing but a piece of whatever. And immediately the other students look at him and they just like stand up and just like, yeah, come with us. And they go outside in the hallway and they just talk for 5 minutes. And I continue teaching my lesson. And by the end of it, everyone comes back, the student's kind of silent, he's like looking around and he realizes that the other students are kind of giving him a little bit of the stink eye. And then the next day, this student comes up to me and he apologizes. I barely said a word to this one new student, but he was already apologizing to me. And it was in that moment where I really started seeing the long-term effects of restorative justice. So when I came to law school, I didn't know how I was going to continue with that tradition of restorative justice. But I was fortunate that I met a man named Russell Ballinger, who leads the Circle of Peace movement. I don't know if any of you know it. But he came to the clinic asking for advice for one of the young people he was working with. And I went to the circle and I was fascinated at how much support the Circle of Peace movement gives each individual person in terms of housing, employment, food, and it helps them get to a place where they view the community that's around them as this sacred thing that they don't want to hurt. So I'm very glad that I got to tell this story because I truly believe in restorative justice, and especially for people who come from systems that don't trust the support that they're supposed to have around them, whether it be the government or organizations. And through restorative justice, I really saw a little bit more of that trust in the people who were participating in the circles and in the process. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. For those of you I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I'm Rob Vischer. I'm the Dean here at St. Thomas Law School. I'd like to invite our next panel up to the platform, and we'll get started in just a moment.
So I'm going to introduce the panelists and then turn it over to them for some remarks, and then hopefully we'll have some time for some questions and answers. So you've already met Dr. Williams. Next to Dr. Williams is Randy Roth. Ms. Roth is Executive Director of Interfaith Action. She's also worked as the Executive Director of Philanthropy for the Bremer Foundation, as a court-appointed monitor for a national civil rights lawsuit brought by 22,000 African-American farmers, and as an attorney for Farmers Legal Action Group before becoming the group's Executive Director. She serves as chair of the Legal Services Advisory Committee to the Minnesota Supreme Court and as a board member for the Minnesota State Bar Association Foundation. Next to Ms. Roth is Brenda Burnside, who is the founder and CEO of Let's Circle Up Restorative Services. She has previously served as the Restorative Practices Coordinator for the Dispute Resolution Center in St. Paul, which is a local nonprofit organization and the oldest mediation organization in Minnesota. Prior to her work at DRC, Ms. Burnside worked as an outreach director at Educators for Excellence, where she was instrumental in organizing teachers to use their voice and their stories to make changes in education for more equitable outcomes for students and families. She's the president of Conflict Resolution Minnesota's Twin Cities chapter and a contributing member of Reimagining Justice for Youth in Ramsey County. And then to my far right, Reverend Curtis DeYoung is CEO of the Minnesota Council of Churches. Previously, he was Executive Director of Community Renewal Society, which is a 135-year-old faith-based organization in Chicago that works for racial and economic justice through church-based community organizing, policy advocacy, and investigative journalism. He's earned degrees from St. Thomas, Howard University School of Divinity, and Anderson University. He's the author and editor of 10 books on reconciliation, multiracial congregations, interfaith activist spirituality, racism, and cultural diversity. He has also served as a professor of reconciliation studies at Bethel. Please join me in welcoming this panel to our proceedings. So I'm just going to start by turning it over to them to make some opening remarks on the theme of this panel, which is the role of faith and understanding in seeking racial justice through restorative justice. So perhaps Ms. Roth, would you like to begin?
Thank you so much. Happy to. First, let's see who's in the room. How many lawyers are out there? Okay, and how many law students? Okay, so quite a bit of workforce out there potentially. So I'd like to start by saying how impressed I was with the three students. Ricardo, Eduardo, and Emma, you're in there doing the work. It's going to be so fruitful over your lifetime. You're going to build and build and build, and it was really a great pleasure to listen to you, so thank you. So I'm a literalist, and so I looked at the words on the title of this panel, and I want to start, if I can, by touching on 4 of the words or phrases. The first is faith. So I'm just going to talk for a half a minute about faith from a Jewish perspective. I'm Jewish and very involved in Jewish practice. For us, the imperative to seek justice is not hard to find. Genesis 1:26 says, humans are created in the image of God, but B'Tselem Elohim, what more do you need, right? And we have the concept of an obligation to always be working towards repair of the world. Tikkun Olam, it's found in our liturgy and in other more recent sources, but everyone's aware of it. We talk about it all the time. And you have the commandment in Deuteronomy 16, justice, justice shall you pursue, and many other justice-related commandments. So the faith-driven part is easy for me to find. The second word that really struck me in the title of this panel is understanding. And here I'm going to throw to Brenda in just a second. In my mind now, because of an experience I'll tell you about, understanding is linked to the definition of restorative judgment that I learned from my teacher. I'm going to tell you a short story. Ramsey County Attorney John Choi spoke to clergy at my office, Interfaith Action, at an event we hosted, and he put out a plea in that clergy civic engagement meeting saying, I need faith community volunteers to become trained in circle practice. What do I mean by circle practice? It's exactly what Eduardo described in the cell phone theft story. It's a lot like what Ricardo talked about in Come to the Table. It's the being multifaceted that Emma talked about, and Brenda will really talk about, I'm sure, what circle practice is. But his idea is that circle practice, and this is very important, it's not a diversion program. Oh, we're gonna cherry pick a couple of cases and divert them over, but the main criminal justice system is still what it's been. He wants to build an alternative to the justice system that we're used to. So Yohuru talked about not wanting to be aiding and abetting discriminatory systems, not just thoughts or individual actions. And what Attorney John Choi is trying to do is build a different system that's not based on the discriminatory roots of the system we're used to. So he wants to create an alternative to the traditional charge, prosecute, convict, incarcerate pathway that we're all used to. I was one of 3 or 4 moments in my life where I turned because of what someone said and the vision they gave to me. I decided to become trained in circle practice. Brenda was and still is my teacher. I had 11 weeks of training with Brenda, and we had to turn in portfolios at the end, and I have mine with me. And part of that is, what's your definition of restorative justice? And mine, which I think I passed, was restorative practice is actively seeking, and I'm going to say an understanding, the humanity in others and prioritizing their humanity above their actions. So that's my take on what understanding means in the title of this panel, actively seeking the humanity in others. So then the third term here is racial justice. What would racial justice look like at this moment in time, given our long entrenched history of white supremacy and systemic discrimination? And within that, what actions can we take to advance racial justice now? And what subset of that can we advance through restorative justice work? And I'll just say what we're learning together, Yohuru is vice chair of my board, what we're learning together at Interfaith Action is that there are 2 broad bookend ways to think about an answer to that question. One bookend is all about reform. Reform who has a voice. Brenda said that to me last night. Reform police practices, reform prisons, the whole criminal justice system, housing reform, access to healthy food, childcare, transportation, and more. But the other bookend that kind of gets talked about less is a different kind of work. It's more granular, and it's about solving problems one family at a time. And to name it, I'd like to borrow Dr. Williams' term. He talks about historical recovery or historical reclamation. This bookend is about helping people reclaim their freedom and their resources, reclaim an economic foothold in this community. We have systematically pushed people into poverty and into prisons. Reform is the pathway to stop doing that going forward. Reclamation is the pathway to help undo the damage that's already been done. So I'd like to put a spotlight on 2 ways that we can engage in this reclamation work. And the first is for everyone, and the second has a special role for lawyers and law students. So the first is get trained in circle practice. And I'm not going to talk a lot about it because I know Brenda will, but participate in circles. Do it in the criminal justice system. Do it in your neighborhoods. Do it in your houses of worship. And we'll hear more about that, I'm sure, in just a moment. The second is for lawyers, paralegals, law students. One important way for lawyers and incipient lawyers to do restorative justice work, reclamation work to advance racial justice, is to volunteer in free legal clinics. take pro bono cases into your law firms. Become part of the system that delivers legal aid to those in need. In low-income communities, people tend not to know all of their rights, everything they're entitled to, and they don't know how to get their rights enforced in an affordable way. You might say, well, why don't they just go to legal aid? Institutional legal services programs like Mid-Minnesota Legal Assistance and Southern Minnesota Regional Legal Services, where Eduardo worked, unfortunately have to turn away more than 60% of eligible clients who ask for help because of lack of resources. What happens to those people? Legal clinics boost families' abilities to gain an economic foothold, to gain housing stability, and to meet their families' goals. People need help in civil matters, including defending evictions, and that's going to skyrocket. Access to COVID-related benefits that my guess is the lawyers in this room have not completely figured out. COVID-related unemployment insurance, rental assistance, SNAP, and more. Resolve hazardous conditions in housing, deal with domestic violence, employment-related concerns like wage theft, discrimination, harassment, appeal public benefits denials, and more. So in conclusion, lots of work is going on in this community. There is tremendous unmet need, and we're inviting you to come join us.
Ms. Burnside?
Thank you. I was so glad to let him fumble with that. I want to begin by acknowledging that the land we gather on today is stolen land. I want to acknowledge the original keepers of this land. I want to thank them for their contributions. I also want to honor the missing narratives of those who have come to our country, some by force and some by choice, who have been erased, and their contributions have been erased from our history. I start with that because that is a harm that we often overlook in our midst, and it causes more harm. That's one of the things that we always begin circle with. And we do that because there are many egregious harms that have happened on these shores, and that is the beginning of our racial healing. So with that, as Randy was saying, I consider myself to be a circle keeper and a community member. And the reason that I say that is because each of us, we are able to connect at the level of our humanity regardless of our experiences. Many people think you have to have similar experiences to be able to make a connection. That is not true. But we can always connect at the level of our humanity. That's why the definition that Randy shared on today is the only definition that I use in restorative practices, because all of the other things are layers that we put on top of our humanity, and we tend to ignore and forget about the humanity that exists underneath it. I have the distinct pleasure of working with restorative practices in the school district, as well as in the justice system, as well as in the community. So I get to see and talk to a lot of people and build a lot of relationships, and I have heard stories that you would think unimaginable. So one of the very important things about this particular process is that in the justice system, for example, I listen to cases, and sometimes what you read on the page doesn't match up. I said, wait a minute, there's more to that story, right? I said, I know there's something else there. Nobody does that. So I'm going to tell you about a case that I had where there was an older lady, and she and her husband came in for a circle in our community. And her crime or harm that was done was that she stole Tylenol and vitamin E. I saw the case, I read the report. I said, nobody steals Tylenol and vitamin E. I said, there's a story there. What is the story? She came to our circle in broken English. We only could really exchange and recognize a couple of words. But when she sat down, she was broken. She was completely broken. And just looking at her, and I said, what happened? Why did you need these things? Well, it turns out that her husband of 40 plus years threw out his back at work. Now, this man, age-wise, probably shouldn't have even been working. But he threw out his back lifting a wet rug, didn't realize that it was wet, and threw his back out. He was in pain, but he was convinced that he shouldn't miss a day of work. So turns out that they are seniors and they have health insurance, but guess what? It doesn't cover over-the-counter medication. Doesn't cover over-the-counter medication. Her whole restitution was $120 where she was buying this Tylenol. So I said to her, I said, I am sorry that you felt that you had to steal things that you needed. I said, that troubles me that you had to do that. I said, was there nowhere else that you could go? Nobody that you could go to. So I just want us to know that at that point, I had nothing in common with her other than our humanity. I could feel for her what she felt for her husband of 40 plus years. And I said to her, at the level of this humanity, I would have gone in my pocket and given you the money for these over-the-counter medications. These are the people who we are calling criminals. These are the people that we put in prison for the things that they need. This is the reason that I do restorative practices. In the school system, we have similar things going on where people have stories that lead them to doing things that they don't necessarily want to do, but things that they need, or humanity that needs to be seen and uncovered. With all of that said, when we do restorative practices, we look for needs. We look for harm and needs. We don't think of it in terms of crime and punishment. We think of it in terms of this person has something going on, a trauma or something that has happened in their lives, and we want to know the story. And I always tell my students, get the story. Don't leave without the story. You're the investigative reporter. Find out, what is that thing? How do we make that connection with the student? How do we make that connection with the community, right? Some people just feel separated from other people. They just feel like, I'm not connected in any way to this, so I feel no ownership. I have no vested interest here. But I will say this, and I know I only have a few minutes. I can't explain restorative practices in all of in 8 minutes. But I will say that I don't call it restorative justice because I'm not sure that justice can ever be really achieved on this side of heaven. But I will say that we can practice and practice and practice until we get it right. So as long as we're continuing to work on our language and the words that we use and how we refer to people, as long as we can continue to seek people's humanity and prioritize their humanity above their actions, and I say that because we are more than just what we do. Sometimes we do things, and I will tell you that that is not my character. My very favorite school supply in any school year, any given school year, and I just left school actually, is an eraser. I have a jumbo eraser, and that is to erase all of the moments in my life that I wish I could redo, that I wish I could do over, that I wish that I was thinking better or in a better place or felt better about myself or my humanity in a way that I could have done that differently. I'll bet my ex-husbands wish that too. But I just want you to know that everybody has those moments. Everybody makes those mistakes. Everybody rethinks those things and wish they could reset. I will tell you that. But I enjoy doing community circles because it changes the shape of my lens. Every time I meet someone and I hear their story, I am different and better for it. I look at the world in a different way. There are students who come into my classroom or they come into my space and want to have a circle, and they say things to me, and I was like, wow, I could never think of that the same way again. Those are the things that we look for in restorative practices. Randy also mentioned the collaborative review team, where we actually review cases. And we look at those cases and we look at what is the family needing. Why did this happen? Why did this take place? And then we think about what happened, because some of the stuff just doesn't tell us the story. So my job specifically is to go out and find out what was the story, what really did happen. And we find that sometimes it's much different from what we've read. So I'm sure I took more than my time. I wasn't counting, sorry.
Reverend DeYoung.
Good evening, everyone. It's good to be here and have a chance to share with you. I certainly am always inspired by Dr. Yohuru Williams, who's now becoming my favorite black historian and racial justice historian. And thank you to the practitioners, the students, and to my colleagues who do this work in the faith community. I'm the only clergy, I think, on this panel, so I'm going to speak more directly to the role of faith in seeking racial justice through restorative justice. And I also want to kind of lean into that idea of the intersections. And so I would also add the terms reparations and reconciliation, which Dr. Williams has already brought into the conversation in his opening remarks. I think that it's important to think about the role of faith. Now, it should be obvious to us, I suppose, sitting here at a faith-based institution, the University of St. Thomas, which has a law school, that these intersections would be obvious to us. And maybe there's many other ways we should think about the obviousness of the role of faith. But I thought that it was important that I needed to make the case for the role of faith. So I looked at perhaps the most famous lawyer of the 20th century, a man named Nelson Mandela, who became the first president, as you all know, of a free South Africa, the first black president of South Africa, who became an inspiration to the first black president of the United States, Barack Obama, another lawyer. What is it about lawyers? These lawyers are something else. But Nelson Mandela understood when it was time to transform South Africa, when it was time for folks who had been oppressed for hundreds of years to have to live in society with their oppressors, he needed a partner with the faith community. And so he reached out to Archbishop Desmond Tutu and many other faith leaders as he built the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And he understood that some of the things that needed to be addressed were matters of the heart. Some things that needed to be addressed were matters of accountability. And as a lawyer president, he also needed partners from the faith community. I have here Desmond Tutu's book, No Future Without Forgiveness, and where he describes the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process. But I just want to read a couple lines where he talks about justice. He says, retributive justice, in which an impersonal state hands down punishment with little consideration for victims and hardly any for the perpetrator, is not the only form of justice. Nelson Mandela understood that. Tutu says, I contend that there's another kind of justice, restorative justice, which was characteristic of traditional African jurisprudence. Here the central concern is not retribution or punishment, but in the spirit of Ubuntu, the healing of breaches, the redressing of imbalances, the restoration of broken relationships. This kind of justice seeks to rehabilitate both the victim and the perpetrator, who should be given the opportunity to be reintegrated into the community he or she is injured by his or her offense. Thus, we would claim that justice, restorative justice, is being served when efforts are being made to work for healing, for forgiveness, and for reconciliation. All words that we highly value in the faith community. As a Christian, we read often in the New Testament of reconciliation. Jesus lived it out. The Apostle Paul wrote often. The Greek word that's used in the New Testament is katalasso, which talks about reconciliation. We've often lost its power in modern society. The language of reconciliation has been sent to the margins. It's been seen as accommodation or assimilation. But the reconciliation that was being called for in the first century by a small population of Jewish folks who had embraced Jesus. Remember that these were Jewish folks who had been colonized and oppressed by the Roman Empire. So reconciliation is being, much like we're talking about restorative justice, much like Bishop Tutu was saying, it's being called for in the midst of oppression. And what I find powerful about this is I follow the story in the New Testament is that Jewish folks oppressed by Rome sought their own healing through their relationship with God, the role of faith. And as they experienced that healing, they thought, maybe those Romans and those Greeks who are oppressing me can also experience this kind of healing. And maybe there is an opportunity for us to live together in society. And that's what first century, what we call churches now, which were gatherings that happened in the homes of Jewish people, was they would invite Romans and Greeks into their homes and built community under the leadership of Jewish spiritual leaders in these first century, what we now call churches, which sounds to me a lot like circle, restorative justice circles. That you have to come and now you have to hear my pain. You have to hear my struggle. And you have to understand it and you have to embrace it as someone who has perpetrated that against me. But yet, because of your humanity, I believe there's also hope for you too, built in understanding of shared humanity. That's the power, I think, that we find in our religious faith traditions, whether it be Judaism, and these were a group of folks who were practicing Jews, who had embraced Jesus, whether it comes in Islam, remember salam, peace, the essence of Islam, and Buddhist and Hindu traditions and many others as well. The role of faith, I think, is very important in the work for racial justice through restorative justice practices. Reparations, and I close with a plea for reparations. The Minnesota Council of Churches in the last year has embraced on a initiative of truth-telling, education, and reparations, because we believe that all of what we're talking today now has to be challenged at this level of societal injustice. The inequities, the racial disparities that we experience here in the state of Minnesota have created so much harm over the years, and that harm needs to be repaired. So I'm looking for a racial justice that restores, that repairs, that reconciles. And actually, you can use any of the terms, and they all sort of mean the same thing, as Dr. Williams led off in our presentation.
Thank you. I'd like to give panelists an opportunity to respond briefly to something that they heard from a fellow panelist that might have sparked an idea in you, if you'd like to offer anything.
I guess that's me.
Go ahead.
I too brought a book that I want to acknowledge, the Little Book of Race and Restorative Justice by Fania Davis. And many of the concepts that you've mentioned are in the book. One of the things that she notes is that it took 40 years into the process of restorative justice for us to even acknowledge race, to acknowledge that there were some traumas that happened here on our shores. And we were going about all of our social activation and all of that stuff. And guess what? We forgot to include race. We forgot to think about it. Yet, most of the people who were being impacted in our justice system were people of color. We totally ignored race for 40 years. Not a day or two, not a week or two, but for 40 years. I'm thinking we probably didn't want to think about it, right? But now, as we look forward, we really have to deal with this thing of race before we can really come to some healing. I think we're seeing a lot of that coming out and manifesting itself in the things that we're seeing across the news and throughout our communities now, that we haven't dealt with that. That's one of the reasons that I acknowledge some of the harms. But I also want to acknowledge that if we don't change our mindsets before we get to circle, we're just putting a square in the middle of that circle. So we really have to deal with our own biases. We have to deal with that concept of shalom, also called right relationship. And our white supremacist ideas actually mess up that whole ecosystem of what right relationship or shalom really means. And we don't realize that. I'm wondering, why is it that the worship hour on Sunday morning is the most divided one in the entire week? If we believe in the concept of shalom, if we are really trying to live in right relationship. But if we think about it, sometimes I think we think in terms of, and when I say white supremacy, I'm not talking about all of these extremist groups. What I'm thinking about is just the concept that somehow the way I live is much better than the way you live. Maybe it's just that we live differently. Doesn't have to be anything right or wrong. Doesn't have to be guilt or innocence. It could just be we live differently, and that should be okay. So, when she says that in her book, she mentions that in the book also, the whole concept of this whole right relationship. And just kind of talks about where some of that stuff comes from. And if we look back and actually read some of the history, we might find that it doesn't make very much sense to us anymore. Some of it out of context really doesn't mean a whole lot. And I won't go into the particulars of that, but I found that was interesting when he was talking about reconciliation and how we reconcile some of those ideas. Because I have young people who come at me all the time and say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why do we do that? And I was like, yeah, you know what? Why do we do that? I'm not quite sure. I said, but you know what? We can Google it. We can Google everything. So that would be my own concept.
I would just add, you need to look at this book. Randy Roth brought this book with her.
Well,
I was just
because Brenda was my teacher.
Well, and just last week I was in a group conversation with Fania Davis. She's a lawyer. Her better known sister is Angela Davis of the Black Power Movement days and still very active today. But Fania Davis was the lawyer for her sister when she was in prison. She's an amazing, she's making amazing contributions to this conversation right now.
Ms. Roth or Dr. Williams, anything you want to add at this point?
Very quickly, I think.
Or do you want to grab the?
Very, very quickly, I think all three commentaries, in addition to what we shared in the previous panel, is this idea, and I think you articulated it beautifully, Curtis. Wounds produce narratives. the sharing of narratives should encourage us in a way that Paulie Murray talked about to either close ranks or build a bigger circle. And I think what's really powerful about what was shared and how all of the comments today kind of created a synergy is this opportunity to create that bigger circle.
And the one thing I'll add, building off of what Dr. Williams just said, I think I have two mics here, is, you know, if you're a lawyer or a law student, it's so easy to just do your life and never go over there. You're gonna make okay money, and you have your house, you have your family, you have your TV, you have everything, and you can live a life where you're not really encountering what's going on in community. But if you can open yourself to it, you have so much skill, you can do so much good, but you have to put yourself in the situation. That's what these three students have done, but it's very easy to never do it. Maybe not at St. Thomas, I don't know. I was a clinic person in my law school as well. But once you open your eyes, you can never not see it again. But it's that moment of opening eyes.
So you've given some good, helpful tips in terms of getting trained in circle practices, a book recommendation, and I imagine there will be some folks here, maybe law students, maybe lawyers, maybe members of the community who say, I want to start down this path. I want to take the next step down this path. What should they also keep in mind and expect in terms of some of the frustrations, challenges, and limitations that come with embarking on restorative practices as a means toward racial justice? What do they need to keep in mind about the hard parts of this path?
I would say you need to learn how to sit with trauma. You need to learn how to sit with discomfort, because you will hear things in circle as people share their stories that won't feel good. And when they don't, just realize that it's working, that you're changing the shape of your lens, that you're seeing a perspective that you haven't seen before. And I would ask that you embrace that. And what we tend to do is want to ask questions and do research into it. No research. No research. Look in your own heart and mind. Embrace what they said. Take in their story. I tell people, absorb it, right? Before becoming defensive, before giving a response, because there is no response you can give to somebody else's experience. So I would say when you hear those difficult things, and you will hear them, I have been in circles and I have been uncomfortable with what I've heard. But if you will absorb it and accept it as their experience, not necessarily for your life, but honoring their choice and just hearing their story and listening carefully, and embracing them as a part of of your community, just as you would embrace a part of your own story that is unpleasant. I have many relatives that I would not want you to know that I am related to, but I accept them. They carry our name, so they are mine. I claim them. But they're not necessarily the best part of my story. So if I'm first meeting you for the first time, I'm not going to introduce you to that relative. Okay, I'll just say that. But guess what? That's part of my story. That's part of who I am. I listen to that. I receive it. I embrace it. I don't agree with everything I hear in circle. But isn't that okay? Everybody won't think the way I do. They don't raise their kids the way I do. You know, it's just, but that is one of the difficult parts that people are not ready for often, because they think everybody's gonna be friends and friendly in circle. That is not always the case. They are always respectful because we require it, we monitor that, but it's not always easy. It's not easy to hear.
Oh, I think I don't need this. And I'll say one more hard thing, and then if I can, one amazing thing. So one more hard thing, and I'm, of course, everything Brenda said is right and really important, and I'm gonna add one thing to it, which is if you do legal clinic, one of the hard things, it's so much work. It's really hard. I'm in the middle of 2 weeks of helping a young woman I met in clinic expunge very old criminal records, and the way, you know, it goes back to Dr. Williams' point about systems that were built to perpetuate discrimination. Because when you see how much work it is to expunge one offense on a record, and most people don't just have one, you know, like this young woman, this thing happened and she was parked 20 feet from a walkway, and that's a separately charged offense, and this and this and this. Each one is its own paperwork and service and this and this and this. We have about 100 hours of work to get this cleaned up. Now our team is gonna do it, but it's really hard and you see how it doesn't get done. But if you don't clean it up, she's never gonna get an apartment, she's never gonna get a job, she's never gonna get that economic foothold. So be prepared for hard work. And the other thing I'll say to counterbalance that is, you get the most amazing colleagues in the world. You know, you get into the group of people who are doing this work, and it's just kind of like you get upgrades several times a day in terms of the character of your relationships, and you're enriched in ways you never even thought were coming.
I'll add quickly, I think you also have an opportunity, and this has been true of our relationship, Randy. You end up, Jesuits have a saying, go forth and set the world on fire, and I always joke, you shouldn't say that unless you're very specific with people about what needs to be burned. When you work with great people, and this has been my experience with Interfaith Action, I never, always embraced and understood at a deep level the African American experience. Working at Interfaith, understanding our work with Native populations, being exposed to the work that Curtis's group is doing in that regard, has opened me up and put me in a position to be much more expansive in my thinking about what justice looks like across communities. And that whole notion of shared humanity that we talked about. The Theodore Parker quote, the reason I love that so much is, if you break down that moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice, it's the things that we do in practice that end up defining that and what that looks like. Our Indian work at Interfaith Action is the most inspiring to me because it's the farthest from my own experience. It's what forces me the most to be vulnerable, to grow, to acknowledge what I don't understand, and puts me in that space of always revisiting harm, as Brenda talked about, from another person's lens. And that, to me, I think, makes you burn in a way for justice that's difficult to replicate if you stay myopically focused on your own trauma. It's important in that sense to kind of experience stories differently, to be awakened to the global challenge of white supremacy, the challenges that we associate in a larger sense with what injustice looks like in different spaces, that I think can awaken that fire in you. And I'll make a pitch again for our law school students in particular. If you're looking for that first step of that long journey, I can't think of a better place to do it than in clinic with us at Interfaith Action. It is remarkable work that group of people does, and we certainly could use your help. And you will you'll pick up that spark.
I just want to add one thing, and this is something that comes up with me every week when I'm discussing cases. With some of our attorneys, usually the ones on the prosecution side more than the others, we often always want to focus on the crime itself, the harm that was done. We focus on that. We also focus on the victim who has been harmed, right? And we focus on the severity of the crime. So when we do that, though, we take the focus off of community. Now, most people think that's totally fine. Oh yeah, that's what we should be doing. We should be, caring for all of the people who have been harmed. But one of the ways that I kind of explain it, and the attorneys kind of have a hard time accepting this, and I kind of want to run it by you guys because you're going to be doing this. So I tell them, I'm a gardener, and when I look at my garden, I look at the condition of the plant in order to change the condition of the soil. I don't look at the condition of the plant for the solution, right? So I'm looking for I'm trying to produce in the community a condition that does not breed people who have to steal, or doesn't breed people who feel they have to defend themselves, right? So we often disagree on that point because we're always looking at the victim, but the victim always has a voice in community, right? So it's not like we're not listening, but it's like it's the same voice that everyone has. So yes, you should come, and we need that so that we know the impact of what the action or the harm has done to the victim. But we often focus on that, and we miss the whole thing that we need to fix in the community. So I don't want us to miss that. And let me give you an example, and this is rooted in a racial example. There are many black men who have gone to prison and served terms behind victims, white victims often, who have claimed harm. Now, what we did was we focused on that harm. We focused on that crime. We focused on that person, and we didn't look at what it was doing to the community overall. So we've made some mistakes behind doing just those things. So I would encourage you, look for what is going to repair the community. Not that we ignore the victims, not that we ignore anyone's voice, because in restorative practices, we are giving voice to people who have historically and traditionally been marginalized and have been eliminated from the conversation. So people are living in these communities, and they are feeling badly because they're not even included in the solution for the space that they live in. We don't even ask them, what would work? What should we do? What do you need? We don't ask them. We just come in with a solution that we think works from the outside, a whole different lens. So I would just say, if we can at all, let's make it a community focus. How do we heal our communities so that they don't breed people who we have to incarcerate, people that we have to separate? We have created those things. So that's my 2 cents. I'm done.
That was beautiful, because that answers a sort of a lingering question that I'm guessing some folks have. When they think about restorative practices, they see the power and the beauty and the healing potential in them, but they might in the back of their head think, yeah, but all the systems are still there. The systems are still there. I've poured myself into this relationship, but the systems, and that the image of the plant and the soil is a powerful way to integrate those. So thank you for that. I'd like to call the Vice President of Mission for St. Thomas, Father Chris Collins, to the platform just for a closing remark. But as he's coming up, could you please join me in thanking these panelists?
Thank you so much. And I was thankful that Father Griffith invited me to offer a few, I don't know what, integrating remarks or summation remarks here. And I'm getting more and more paralyzed as I'm thinking about having heard from a whole variety of you how powerful in a whole series of different ways that my own heart has been moved, my mind is connecting all sorts of different things about our Catholic identity of the university. I'm thinking about St. Thomas. He starts with experience. We learn beginning with actual concrete experience in the world, whether that's in the sciences or especially in humanity, right? And hearing those stories and getting up front, I'm racing through my mind about the different, having taught last semester the course, a course on theologies of justice and peace, and that the 4 steps that Brian Stevenson talks about that I used in my class about getting proximate, getting close to where there's pain, allowing that to change the narrative. As you say, wounds produce narratives. We can start to see the world differently after we get close. We remain hopeful, but how do we remain hopeful? It's practicing. I forget who talked about, it's not the justice, but it's the practice itself. I love that. It's the habit of forcing ourselves to get out into these sorts of situations that are uncomfortable. He says his final step there, as I recall, is get used to being uncomfortable. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable. I think this is just so profoundly what you've helped us uncover in a whole variety of ways this afternoon is the task of being human, it seems to me, right? It's also profoundly spiritual and it's profoundly religious, but this is This is the recovery of our humanity, really, that is at stake, it seems to me. And practicing and making mistakes and getting out into places that are uncomfortable and hearing and allowing our hearts to be pierced along the way, allowing our hearts to be transformed in those experiences. This is precisely what makes us more human, and I think ultimately more divine too. One last quick little thought. I don't know why this came to me, but I was thinking, you know, in the gospel, if I recall correctly from a theology class a while ago, the Gospel of Mark, right in the middle of the gospel, exactly in the text itself, is the passage where Jesus starts asking those disciples, who do people say that I am? And they give lots of different interesting historical possibilities. And then he puts them on the spot and says, who do you say that I am? And then for a moment, Peter gets that one answer correctly. You're the one who's going to save us. You're the Messiah. You're the anointed one. He gets it right. And then immediately, this is the turning point of that gospel. He says kind of the right thing. And then Jesus immediately starts talking about, for the redemption of the world to happen, there is a pathway of pain and suffering and loss and death even. That not just for himself, but for all of us. The pathway forward for redemption comes through places of pain and our own hearts being pierced and coming to new life that way. And then as you might recall, Peter also says, no, that's not what I'm signing up for, right? Don't say that. Let's stay with, you're the Messiah. We're going to win with you. He wants to back away immediately. I think it's such a great tension point, even without coming out of our own, my own Catholic and Christian perspective. But it keeps us in that place of tension, right? That has been uncovered in a whole variety of different ways with real stories and real practice. And so I'm very, on the one hand, sort of overwhelmed by the needs that are before us in our world, in our human family. But I also find this afternoon, but also the project of the Restorative Justice initiative coming out of the law school and collaborating with so many people. I am immensely energized by this work and what is possible in a whole variety of different circumstances that lay ahead, because I think this is absolutely the way forward. This kind of cultivating of our humanity, right? And restoring human relationships. That is very messy and very urgent to be undertaking. So I'm so grateful for this opportunity to get the imagination going, get our hearts uncomfortable, and to be encouraged to get out there in whatever way that might look like for us. And I think there will be follow-up communications from the Institute about different ways to continue to learn, continue to experience some of the circles and so on. There's also next month, if you told me correctly, it's not set yet, right? Another webinar about on polarization, date to be determined, but a different entry point into the same kind of practices. And above all, we need you to remain here for the reception where we continue these conversations and have a chance to speak with some of our presenters. And just one more final round of applause for everybody who has opened up a great vision for us.